As Jesse Unruh, Speaker of the California Assembly in the 1960s, once said, quote, "Money is the mother's milk of politics," unquote. Raising and spending money in politics became considerably easier under the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United ruling that gave corporations and unions unfettered access to the political process. The Supreme Court's decision gave rise to increased involvement by nonprofit advocacy organizations, political action committees, and super PACs in the political process. The result? Over $1 billion raised by each presidential candidate, and over $300 million spent on congressional races, a near four-fold increase from 2008. And in California, almost $375 million was spent on just the state propositions alone. Is this merely the exercise of free speech, or are politics becoming hijacked by special interests? We'll ask. Kevin Yamamura, political reporter for the Sacramento Bee. And Ravel, chair of the California Fair Political Praxis Commission. John Myers, political editor for News 10 in Sacramento. And Dan Walters, political columnist for the Sacramento Bee. Money in politics, the costs of free speech.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. $6 billion was spent on political elections in the U.S. in 2012. How much of that was spent in California? Our first guest is Kevin Yamamura, political reporter for the Sacramento Bee. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk about the money spent in legislative races and propositions in California. How much was spent this year, and how did it compare to previous years?
We think it's close to $500 million in
That's an amazing amount.
Yeah, it is really. When you start using the B word, it is a lot. I mean, so initiatives alone, we're talking close to $400 million of that, and we saw a lot of very wealthy individuals participating this time. You also had some very expensive legislative races that took up airtime, and there's a high demand for that airtime, driving up costs. So
that really led to it. But that's sort of $500 million in California alone.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a crazy amount. Some people are talking about the influence of secret groups and wealthy donors on the election in particular. I mean, go through the propositions, and about half the proposition, it seems, were sponsored primarily by one wealthy donor. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, in California, it's a big state with a lot of big media markets, and very expensive to be successful with ballot initiatives to get your message across. And particularly when there's so many initiatives this time, we had a lot of wealthy individuals participating. You mentioned, there are two from one family alone: Molly Munger, her brother Charles Munger Jr.
They apparently outspent the California Teachers Association 2-1.
That's hard to do.
That's amazing.
You had Mercury Insurance chairman participating on Prop 33. You had Tom Steyer, who had a clean energy and corporate tax initiative. So yeah, I mean, and these guys are all very wealthy individuals.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that people talked a lot about was this influx of cash at the last minute, this $11 million that was used unsuccessfully to defeat Prop 30, the governor's tax for education, and support Prop 32, the effort to curtail union fundraising through employee contributions. What happened there?
That came in the last month of the campaign. We saw, in fact, I remember when the donation hit. It was during one of the presidential debate nights. We saw it come across $11 million from this group with this name that was, Americans for Responsible Leadership. You couldn't discern anything from that name. Based in Phoenix, nobody had ever heard of it. We, tried to track down where they were from, what they were about. Couldn't find that out really, other than that they had ties to conservatives in Arizona. And the FPPC ultimately jumped on it.
The FPPC is?
The state's campaign finance watchdog.
Okay.
And so they jumped on the case after they got a complaint from a Common Cause, good government group. So they demanded, through a lawsuit, they demanded documents from this organization, Americans for Responsible Leadership. They fought in the courts. Courts sided with them. At first, the trial court said, you're right, FPPC, but this group does not have to turn over the documents immediately before the election. So then they had to fight at the next level and the next level. Finally, it's the California Supreme Court on the final weekend before the election said, hand over the documents.
Was this kind of like a rope-a-dope? I mean, just stalling game? So
that's what, a lot of people think it was a rope-a-dope, and it ultimately turned out, a day before the election, we find out that they have ties to two other groups with connections in D.C. and with ties to some big national conservative donors.
So the name the Koch brothers was thrown around, but do we really know whether or not?
We haven't seen the smoking gun or any document that says Koch brothers. They've denied it, kind of in a murky way. They've denied it, although they didn't fully deny their participation. So it's...
But part of these organizations, part of the attraction, I think, to donors is that their names are not released. Isn't that the case? So isn't that their argument, that that confidentiality should trump disclosure?
That is their argument. I mean, it's nonprofits. This is not just a California issue, but one that is taking shape across the country in the wake of a few Supreme Court decisions, most notably Citizens United. And so the states are actually becoming the ones leading the way in terms of trying to fight this confidentiality and trying to force disclosure. We'll see. This is an issue that's going to play out both in the Capitol through new legislation and also in the courts.
So what's going to happen specifically with this case? Do they just drop it because the election's over, or what?
The FPPC says they're looking for more information from the two other groups that were behind the donation. They've called it money laundering. They say they're going to keep fighting. I think what we're going to see is some more legislation in this new session to force disclosure. You'll probably see this end up in court, and maybe it goes to the highest court.
I guess we'll see. Well, thank you very much for being here. Up next, we'll hear from the chair of the California Fair Political Practice Commission. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by Ann Ravel, chair of the California Fair Political Practice Commission. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much.
First, can you briefly describe what the FPPC does?
Yes, the FPPC is the state independent agency in charge of disclosure of political campaigns, contributions, expenditures, and also ethics of public officials. And we also oversee lobbying, and we have, of course, an enforcement function.
Well, there was a very big case recently in this last election about an $11 million last-minute donation, and you took some action based on that donation. Why did you think some action was necessary?
Well, first and foremost, there was a complaint filed with regard to that expenditure. But when we looked into it, which we always do when there's a complaint, we discovered that not only was the $11 million the biggest campaign contribution made that was anonymous in California history, but the group that made the contribution was from Arizona, had never made a contribution or any kind of activity in a political campaign in California before.
Don't they have to disclose who the donors are in California?
Yes. Our law with regard to disclosure is much more stringent than most laws throughout the country. And they do have to disclose who the donors are. They disclosed a group. It was the Americans for Responsible Leadership.
Sounds like a reasonable
donor.
Group.
It does sound reasonable, but we did not know who was behind the contribution. And so when we asked them, they refused to give us information so that we could find out whether it was consistent with our law.
I don't want to get too wonkish here, but there's different kinds of organizations that give money. There's super PACs. There's these things called 501c4s. I think this was a 501c4, which is referred to as a social welfare organization, which is not established with the sole purpose for politics, so therefore they don't have to disclose their donors under the federal law.
Under the federal law, they don't. Under California law, they do, if their donors knew or had reason to know that the money was going to a political activity in California. And our opinion was $11 million 2 weeks before the election. It gives rise to a question that we wanted them to answer.
So at the end of the day, you ended up chasing them around the country, basically, from Arizona to Virginia, et cetera. But did you ever find out who the actual donors were?
Well, we did not find out any names of actual people. But what we did find out was that Americans for Responsible Leadership was in fact a shell organization.
I think you referred to it as money laundering.
It is. Under our law, it's money laundering, because in California, if you give a campaign contribution, you must give that contribution in your name. And the Arizona for Responsible Leadership was actually not giving a campaign contribution. They were just a pass-through organization, or a shell, for two other 501c4s.
Well, what would you say to those who say, in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because they weren't disclosed anyway, so they basically did rope-a-dope until after the election, so all of this attempt to get the name, at the end of the day, it didn't matter because the name was never disclosed prior to the election?
Unfortunately, we didn't find out the names of the human donors, but I think the fact that they spent so much effort trying to avoid giving the names to the California voters was significant. And the California voters have a right to know. Our law requires that they know who's giving money in California. And the fact that they didn't actually find out, but saw these machinations to try to prevent it to be found out, I think was significant for the voters.
So where are we going now? Is this going to be dropped, or is there something going to happen?
The FPPC is now conducting a formal investigation, not only into the Arizona for Responsible, or Americans for Responsible Leadership group, but also the PAC that received the money, and the other two 501c4s, and anybody else that we might find in the course of the investigation that contributed but didn't disclose.
Okay, great. Well, when we come back, we'll discuss the right to know versus the right to privacy when it comes to political donations. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Ann Ravel, chair of the California Fair Political Practice Commission. You know, the right to know versus the right to privacy is a key tension that emerges when the issue of politics and money is raised. So what about the argument that donations should be allowed to be kept secret because of free speech and the need for protection from retaliation? They're more important than transparency.
Well, the public clearly needs to know the information in order to make assessments about how to vote. The courts have been explicit that it is constitutional to require this kind of disclosure that we've asked for. The court in Citizens United said that one of the protections of unlimited independent expenditure money is disclosure.
They actually encourage disclosure.
They absolutely did encourage disclosure, and a number of other courts have done the same. Obviously, the tension between the two exists, and it's important that disclosure not be so broad that it impairs people's privacy rights.
Okay, well, what about ensuring transparency against the idea of the last-minute flood of money, like occurred in the $11 million donation case? I mean, how do you make sure there's transparency at the last minute like that?
It's a challenge to do so. It is a challenge. And under our present law, we saw that it's very difficult and it's easy for these organizations to try to hide the information. So what we're seeking and we're hoping to accomplish is some legislation in the state legislature to enhance the ability to increase disclosure.
But isn't that a favorite campaign tactic, to dump money into a campaign at the last minute?
It is, and hopefully the FPPC will get stronger enforcement abilities before an election, because the election is crucial. People have to know.
Well, what about new forms of political communication, like the use of social media bloggers who are really secretly getting paid by a campaign?
Right.
How do you get disclosure there, transparency there?
And that's a very important initiative that we at the FPPC have been pursuing. We're trying to be fair and not impair the rights of people to openly blog and use the internet. On the other hand, if people are being paid for political statements, they should have to disclose much in the same way that any other political actors have to disclose.
You know, we were talking about the 501c4 organizations. Those are the social welfare organizations that are not primarily organized for politics under the IRS code. But some of these are spending a lot of their time and money in politics, actually. Is the IRS doing anything to against those organizations that are violating the rules?
The IRS has apparently sent some letters to a number of 501c4s asking them to justify that they are, in fact, social welfare organizations. But so far, there's no evidence that the IRS has taken any action against these organizations.
Are you hopeful that it may happen?
It's very important that it happen.
I guess well, you don't control that. That's the federal government,
No.
but I guess we'll see. But one thing you can influence is the California legislature. Is there anything going on with the California legislature to increase transparency or to make sure that what you refer to as money laundering doesn't occur in California politics?
Well, money laundering is already a crime in California, and we can enforce on any money laundering activity. But the issue...
And the penalty for that is, I think you had said earlier, I'd heard 3 times the amount of the donation.
Right.
So in this $11 million donation, it's a $33 million fine.
That's correct. It would be a $33 million fine if we go after these groups civilly.
If you can find them.
If we can find them, and obviously if they're able to pay, if they have any money to pay. But we will certainly seek that kind of a penalty if the facts disclose that they knew.
And I interrupted you, and you were saying that what you're going to do with the California legislature this
Right.
year. What will you be asking them, or would you like to see them do in terms of disclosure?
We're asking for much more regulation of independent expenditure committees so that they must disclose all this information if they have made contributions that meet a certain threshold. And we're also asking for the ability to enforce before elections much more quickly.
How can you do that, though, if they're dumping money in 2 or 3 days or a week before an election?
Right. Well, if we have independent authority clearly to force these committees to give us this information, it would go a long way to solving the problem, because then they would be subject to greater penalties if they failed to do so.
Well, I want to thank Ann Ravel, Chair of the California Fair Political Praxis Commission, for joining us. When we come back, we'll discuss the practical impact of money in politics with 2 veteran Capitol observers. Does it make a difference? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by 2 veteran observers of the state politics, John Myers, political editor for News 10 in Sacramento, and Dan Walters, political columnist for the Sacramento Bee. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Dan, we've been discussing this secret $11 million campaign contribution that was unsuccessful in that Prop 30 did pass and Prop 32 didn't. Do you think that that contribution actually backfired?
It probably did in the long run. Although there's 2 ways to look at it. That the opponents of 30 and the proponents of 32 really didn't have much money to spend. So by getting the $11 million, they were able to do some things that they might not have otherwise done. But it probably also had a negative effect. It backfired. Certainly Jerry Brown jumped on it and made a big thing about this secret cabal of somebody from Arizona who's trying to buy California, and sort of political hyperbole. In the end, did Proposition 30 pass and 32 fail because of it and the backlash, or either way? Probably didn't affect the outcome.
But it certainly, I think, became a distraction for the people who wanted 30 to fail and 32 to pass.
You always want a target to aim at, and that seemed to give them a target to aim at.
Yeah.
John, let me ask you, you think there's going to be a push, because of this, a push for increased disclosure of campaign funding?
I do. I mean, I think it raised a lot of questions. I mean, keep in mind that every state has its own campaign finance rules. the debate here was whether or not this outside group had to be subject to California disclosure rules, which were more strict than some other places. Having said that, I think it did, it did point out some holes, loopholes, you might call them, in that law. I've already heard talk. I think you're going to see it in the legislature. I think you're going to see a pushback. It's the argument from Democrats about Citizens United, about the Supreme Court ruling, about that just because you can spend money doesn't mean you can spend money in secret. And so I think you're going to see that. Of course, you have to go to the ballot. You have to get the voters of California to do that. That's a ballot measure the legislature would have to put on the ballot, but I think you'll see it.
Okay. Dan, what about these propositions? I think 5 out of the 11, almost half, were supported by one very wealthy donor. Has that basically turned the populist idea of an initiative kind of on its head?
Yeah, to a certain extent it has. It's what was envisioned as a kind of a populist movement, obviously 100 years ago, has morphed into something that, because of the size of the state, basically, you can't do it that way. You have to do it with money, and you have to have somebody put up the money, whether it's a wealthy organization. In the case of, say, Jerry Brown's Proposition 30, it was the unions basically put up the money, or in the case of a wealthy individual putting up the money, like Charles Munger or something like that.
The Munger family.
Or Munger family, yes, Molly Munger. Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of money. It takes maybe $3 million to qualify a measure for the ballot, and then if it's a serious measure and you're really serious about it, you can look at 10, 15, 20, $30 million more to spend it, and that money doesn't just come in drips and drabs, and because it's a very short time frame and you've got to have the money in hand to do it, and so it's the way it is, and if you want a ballot measure on the ballot these days, you've got to basically put up a lot of money.
Well, that goes to the question of, do you think the legislature is going to attempt to limit the use of initiatives?
I think they're going to discuss it. I mean, again, keep in mind, the only things the legislature can do is put measures on the ballot to amend the state constitution and let the voters have a whack at that. I mean, I think you're hearing it already. You're hearing discussions about could we have an initiative process where the initiative has a sunset clause in it, where it expires after a certain amount of time, where the legislature can go back and tinker in it, which, of course, is going to raise the ire of a lot of people of saying, our whole goal is to work around what they would think would be an intractable set of lawmakers at the state capitol. But, you look at the polling, Californians continue to say they like the initiative process, they'd like some modifications, but what those modifications are, I think that's the tough part.
Okay, there's another aspect to that, is that you have to be careful that if the modifications aren't some sort of a thing to gain some party advantage. The measures the Democrats have put forth in the past have basically had the effect of crippling conservative ballot measures, but not crippling liberal ballot measures. And so you have to put that in the context of the party control of the legislature. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're going to do it because they see some advantage for their party.
Could you see some nonpartisan group like the Little Hoover Commission, or the LAO or the PPIC, or some group come forward with a proposal?
Yeah, you could see them. They've made proposals for years. This has been kicked around in the Capitol for 20 or 30 years. But ultimately, the legislature would have to pass something, or somebody would have to go to the ballot with a ballot measure that would cost lots of money. So it doesn't happen just because PPIC or somebody pops up in the air. Somebody has to take some affirmative action. I don't think the Democrats will do anything that inhibits their allies from putting measures on the ballot. They will try to inhibit their opponents, like, for example, banning paid signature gathering, which leaves the unions able to put measures on the ballot, but not people maybe on the right wing.
We've only got about a minute left in the segment. I want to ask you about the unintended consequences of election reform. Is that one of the reasons, is the increased money in politics the result of more competitive races because of redistricting the top two? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's everything. I think you could talk about electoral changes in candidate races. You can talk about the cost of television. You can the cost of a large state. I mean, I think it's everything. I mean, we are a nation state in California. I don't think anybody should be surprised that we spend more money than anybody else.
And there's one thing you always have to remember about the money that's spent in politics, whether it's campaign money, it's money for ballot measures, it's candidates, or even lobbying expenses for that matter. It's a lot of money. It's maybe $500 million every couple of years in California, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, at least to me, maybe not to you, Mark, but it's a lot of money to me. But you remember the stakes in this thing. The legislature, the governor, the other elected officials and their appointees control, I tried to figure it out, something in excess of $500 billion a year in spending directly, like things like insurance premiums and utility rates and taxes and budgets and federal funds. So the stakes of that are immense, and they are on the order of maybe 1,000 to 1 of the money that's spent in politics.
Well, that might explain it. Well, I want to thank Dan Walters, political columnist for the Sacramento Bee, John Myers, political editor for Sacramento News 10, Kevin Yamamura, political reporter for the Sacramento Bee, and Ann Ravel, chair of the California Political Practice Commission, for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about Valley and state politics, you can log on to our website and sign up for our newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on at www.maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
The Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court, which determined that corporations and unions, in effect, are citizens with a constitutional right to free speech, was supposed to have a dramatic effect on the 2012 elections. The ruling did produce an avalanche of cash, with so-called super PACs and wealthy individuals showering their favorite candidates and causes with unprecedented amounts of cash. Follow the money became the mantra for the media as well as the candidates. But in some cases, identifying donors is nearly impossible because money is laundered through political nonprofits, and laws promoting transparency don't have enough teeth. However, this election taught us something else. A large number of voters are wary of campaigns supported by wealthy, anonymous donors. Voters want to be able to follow the money, and if they can't, there is backlash. While I welcome stricter donor identification laws, citizens in California and many other states demonstrated something important in November. Their votes can't simply be bought. Ideas and candidate qualifications still matter. I'm Bill McEwen for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This has been Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.